Hello friends, welcome back. In the previous video, we have fetched some data in our users hook component. Let's assume that we have another component. In that another component, we want to fetch a different API. For example, we want to fetch photos. So if we want to fetch the photos in the same component, we also have to define a state for photos, a state for error, and a state for is loading. And we have to call our fetch function again, and we have to call fetch function in a different effect, and then we have to define an effect function as well where we call our API. So what that means is that we are duplicating most of the code in two components. We have the same code in two components. This is something we never like in programming because it will be harder to maintain. So how can we resolve this problem? We can resolve the problem by outsourcing the data fetching part of our application. We can create a custom hook which takes a URL and it fetches the data and then return this state variables. So let's see how we can achieve this functionality. Let's create a new file in fetching folder. So I'll create a new file and I'll name it as use fetch.js, and here I will type rafce, and in this function we need to pass URL. And then let's go to usershook.js and let's copy this code and let's paste it here. Since this useFetch component will be a generic data fetching component, so let's remove this and let's rename it to data, and here we need to write the setter function as set data, and we can keep the error and is loading as it is. Now let's go back to users hook and let's copy this use effect function, and here we need to paste it. In this use effect, we are keeping the same functionality except we have to replace this URL to URL. Users will be data, and here also users will be data, and set users will be set data. And now let's return the state variables. So here I'll remove this and I'll return variables as data, error, and is loading. Let's save this. Now let's go back to users hook component, and here we need to import use fetch. So import use fetch from use fetch, and in use fetch here we need to import use state and use effect. Let's save this file and let's go back to users hook, and we need to simply call use fetch, and we need to pass the and we need to pass this URL. So I'll just copy this and I'll paste it here, since this use fetch takes URL as a parameter. So that is the reason we have to pass this URL here in this function. Now we can remove this code. We don't require this. And as you know that use fetch function returns data, error, and is loading, so we can destruct here. So const user, sorry, data, error, and is loading. And in the context of our users hook component, data is user. So basically we can rename this as users. Let's save this, and as you can see, we don't have to change anything in our render part because everything is basically the same. We just outsorted the fetching logic to its own component, which is use fetch. So this will be a React hook. So now we can remove this dependencies which we don't want this. Let's save this and let's go back to the browser. And as you can see that we see the same things. So now let's go back to Visual Studio Code, and as you can see, we have a warning. React hook use effect has a missing dependency URL. So now if the URL changes, then this effect won't run because it is not listed in the dependency. So here we can add the dependency as URL, and let's save this file. So now you can see that warning has gone. So let me minimize this. So how this use fetch basically works. So when we mount our users hook component, we will call use fetch as well. This function gets called and the fetching basically start when we pass the URL here. When the data is ready, the user hooks component update. Since its state changes, but the fetching won't happen again as we pass an empty array. But if we pass the URL, the data fetching happens and basically the state variable will be set. And from that all, we can read this variables, read this state variables. If the state variable changes here, then this component will also get re-rendered since it is using the state variable of useFetch component. So it is very important to know that if we use this useFetch in different component, then that will be totally independent from each other. So if we call use fetch multiple times, even in different components, it will return different data error and is loading variable. So it is very important. So we have successfully implemented our first custom hook. So this is it for this video and I'll see you in the next video.